Well, kia ora, and welcome to a Mini-Hoon here on the Kaka with Natalia Albert, who is writing some really interesting Substack posts over at her Substack, which is called Less Certain, which is an unusual thing for people to read and write on the internet. We're all supposed to know exactly what we think and be right all the time, so that's good. And Natalia, you're very interested in sort of, I think it's interesting. You think a lot about the theory of politics, the practice of it, and some of the big ideas, and things that are curious and beyond the sort of daily horse race, he said, she said, you win, I lose type stuff. And you've written an excellent post this week called The Politics of Trust, What the Wellbeing Era Got Right and Wrong, which I really enjoyed because it looked at an area which has gone awfully quiet in the last 2 years. And I'd just spent 6 years hearing from Treasury, at least, and quite a few people within the government. This was the new thing that New Zealand was going to lead the way in essentially making decisions based on well-being, not some sort of utilitarian, it's all about the GDP man. And then suddenly it's disappeared again. So I thought it was interesting you've jumped on an interesting point here, and also a point about trust. So I thought I'd ask you, firstly, what do you think the future is for this well-being framing, which, it looked quite good. Treasury were using it in theory and everything, and then suddenly it's evaporated. So where to now?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard, for inviting me and asking these questions about that post. It was just an interesting exercise when I was reading this document from the Treasury from 2022, which I was doing last week for my PhD, nothing really specific about it. And it was called Social Cohesion in New Zealand. And it was an output that by law, the Treasury had to produce in relation to the long-term briefings that were also established as a requirement. And there was a lot about well-being in this document. And I had just been to the local government conference in Christchurch the week before, where the hot topic was how they were eradicating the 4 well-beings for the Local Government Act. And I just thought it was a really interesting thing of how, like you say, well-being was the hot commodity. We did 3 well-being budgets at least, right, that were formally titled by that. We had the Social Wellbeing Agency established. We had well-being indicators. Stats was doing all this work. The Treasury was doing it, and it was just everywhere. And all of a sudden, like you say, it all disappeared. But not only did it disappear, it's actively and formally being removed from legislation now. And what I thought was really interesting is, well, if trust in institutions is declining, right? Because that's what the General Social Survey said, and Stats came out with a press release that in 2023, trust was reducing, which was after the 3 well-being budgets. So that decline in trust was during that time. And now we still think trust is declining. So does this matter? Like, do things like well-being as a policy instrument in the budget, in policy outputs, in legislation, in the collective narrative matter in terms of trust? And you could argue that we don't really know, and we're probably measuring it all wrong. But in terms of well-being, I think it will be removed. And if this government gets reelected, it will be turned into cost effectiveness, progress, efficiency, right? Like that language that's been drilled down. And it will be really interesting to see what the General Social Survey comes out in terms of trust in institutions post the first 2 budgets of this coalition government, which hopefully we'll get relatively soon.
Yeah, because I remember when we were talking about well-being with Treasury over those 6 years, and actually it started before the Labor government came in 2017. There was quite a bit of chatter about it, even when Bill English and Stephen Joyce were the finance ministers, and Treasury had done some work that they've got a great sort of cobwebby charty thing, and looked a lot like.
I have it right here.
Yeah. Yeah. No. There was a lot of hard PowerPoint work that went into it, and but I always wanted to just stand on a chair and call bullshit, because what really mattered for the Treasury and the government, and both flavours of government, is not total well-being in some sort of, objective measure. What really mattered, what the North Star of the government was, and not just a fiscal sense, but an operational sense. The North Star was we must get the deficit down to a balance and to reduce net debt to GDP because net debt over around 20 to 30% of GDP was dangerous. New Zealand could be locked out of the markets, interest rates could explode, and everything would be much worse off. And therefore, everything that the government was doing to try to reduce the size of government, to try to, reduce government spending on social issues, on cohesion issues. RNZ, for example, was given some extra money. Now it's been cut back. These sorts of things were subservient to the overall goal, which is debt reduction and reducing the size of the state, which you said something very interesting in your notes to talk about this. You talked about it as a good example of signalling politics. Could you talk a bit more about this idea of signalling politics? Because there's a part of me that wants to shout at most politicians saying most things nowadays, both sides. Bullshit. You're just talking. You're not delivering.
Yes, and I love this idea of signaling politics. It's a little bit along the lines of performative politics and performative policy, right? So there's a lot of examples about this. Diversity and inclusion is one. Well-being is another. Even effectiveness and investment sometimes seems to be like a signaling politics where we just say things to embed it in the cognitive discourse and the narrative and the debate that we're having to give this impression that this is what we're doing. But in reality, if you look at the hard numbers and you look at how things are defined, measured, and implemented, it's nothing. It's ghosts and mirrors. And I guess one caveat that I would say when we're talking about signaling politics and performative policy is that when we're talking about liberal democracies, which is my area of interest, is this political theory element of the frameworks that we operate within. So democracy is this consensus that majority rules. It's a very mathematical kind of governance model where if you get 6 out of 10, you're in. But the liberalism aspect of a liberal democracy has a lot to do with perception of stability and perception of governance. So it has to do with the perception of checks and balances and institutions, right? So the public service is that liberal part where, sure, you can get elected into government, right, through the democratic process, but you still need to respond to this perception of performance and to the checks and balances that these institutions like the public service government gives you as publicly elected officials. And that's the tension between the publicly elected officials and the non-publicly elected officials that we need to hold both of them accountable, right? And so that's...
Yeah. I'm very interested too in this idea that politicians say things and there are laws, and sometimes the politicians change those laws and they say that these changes in the laws and the things they're going to do are going to make things change. And then there's this pregnant pause while in theory, the bureaucrats do the bidding honestly and actively of the politicians and do the things that need to be done. But my impression is that since the late 80s, early 90s, when we had the introduction of the Public Finance Act, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act, the State Sector Act, and then shortly after that, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, the culture of reducing the size of government, keeping net debt low, in fact, reducing it altogether, has been really the driving force in the government. Now, it's expressed and retained in the Public Finance Act, the State Sector Act, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which drive everything. So if you've got some health spending, you've got some education spending, you've got some social welfare spending, the first thing you do is check with Treasury, is this going to move the debt track in the wrong direction?
Correct.
And so that's the North Star. And what strikes me is that Treasury in particular, and I know because I've spoken to them, and you read between the lines and occasionally they say it out loud, they see it as their role, their goal, their sacred task is to stop the politicians from ruining this special power they have, ruining this special thing by overspending. And politicians, they're all trying to get re-elected. So they're all just naturally big spending, high taxing, machines, both sides. And our job as the guardians of this culture and this North Star of getting debt down, always trying to be in balance unless there's some major crisis. And even then we should try and get it down immediately after. That has actually been the driving force in government, not, whoever it is we're elected. And I wonder if the performative nature of politics is politicians themselves saying things and then sometimes being surprised when they don't actually happen. Hopefully they're not being cynical. They're saying things knowing it's not going to happen. Let's see. But I think one of the reasons there's been this decline in trust is for years now, we've seen both sides of politics, not just here in Aotearoa, but Australia, the UK, a lot of what you'd call Western liberal democracy. Yeah, the sort of post-Cold War, we won this thing and the best form of government is a liberal democracy. And globalization and free movement of trade and people and capital and open markets, a nice rule of law. All this is good. However, what I think has happened over the last 20, 30 years is this slow chill has fallen on the arms of government, where the main goal is always get into surplus, reduce government debt. And all of these promises have been made and they've failed, or they've sort of dribbled away into the sand. And that is one of the core reasons why there's this drop in trust in these institutions. I'm just wondering if you think that performative politics has actually been one of the sort of failure gap between promise and delivery has been one of those drivers in undermining trust.
Yeah, for sure. And I think I've written about this before also, like when we have the left in government and we expect them to solve all these problems, right? And they have a broader scope of interest in social issues than the right, let's just assume. They are bound by the neoliberal trend of the 80s and 90s that you described in terms of open markets, trade agreements, reducing the size of government, increasing the size of markets, individual responsibility heightened in terms of the collective. And the left in New Zealand is also bound by neoliberal practices and trends and institutions. So when we established the Treasury and all of the government agencies, we did that under, and this is very theoretical, but under the new public management service where they're built like businesses, right? So each agency has its own logo, its own market, its own product. And they are all bound by those trends in the 80s and 90s that at the moment you could argue we're seeing the shift, because we're seeing that no government has really been able to improve the perception of equality. And so there's two things. There's actual equality, right? Where we could measure poverty poorly across different countries and it's very difficult to measure. But the perception of inequality is way more important than actual inequality. And at the moment in liberal democracies, we have a really high level of perception of inequality and perception of polarization. And I think both sides of the political spectrum are grappling with how to do that. And I think they're doing it so poorly that they're polarizing us further, because they're not really understanding this political landscape of neoliberalism, checks and balances. They don't have the competency as governing bodies to do that. Not elected or non-elected. I worked in public service for years, and there's no real understanding of this political frameworks that we all operate under. It's very sector driven. It's very technocratic. It's very specific to that product that they're selling. And there's very little oversight of the whole ecosystem that we operate at, which is why I'm so interested in that high level theory, why it's so difficult to change things, and why neither side of government can actually solve things like well-being.
Yeah, because what strikes me is whenever I've spoken to ministers about this on both sides and said, do you really think you can achieve these wellbeing aims, like, for example, the Poverty Reduction Act, Child Poverty Reduction Act?
Yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah, or, for example, at various times, various governments have said they want to, improve housing affordability, increase housing supply, all of these things. Both of those would require significant investments in public infrastructure, let alone the sorts of things that would produce social cohesion. So reducing crime rates, improving the costs of living, reducing unemployment, increasing public health through, for example, improving things like vaccination rates and all of these things. It strikes me that there's still this delusion on both the left and the right that they can do it all. They can achieve the North Star and these other things.
And something that, and sorry to interrupt, Bernard, but I think that you hit the nail really well with that, because the other thing we don't talk about is the relationship between policy and our tax frameworks, right? And there's really little understanding that the left is going to come in and do all these things without increasing the tax revenue on any front, wealth, land, whatever you want, and the income brackets. And that relationship between the landscape of neoliberalism, the policies of each government, and the tax frameworks we have to operate in, people don't connect those dots, politicians and voters. And so we're constantly all very confused, I think, which is declining the trust in institutions.
Yeah, and there is this impression I get when I do speak to the finance ministers and the prime ministers. There's this thing, well, if I just try a little bit harder with these bureaucrats, Treasury officials, to convince them, and I'll often get back from them, well, I went to the guys at Treasury and I said, it'd be really good if we did this, and why can't we do it this way? And they'd always come back to me, well, that means the debt track isn't going to work, and you're not going to be in surplus for a year and a half longer than what it would normally be. Here, let me plug this into this model for you just to show you,
Right.
and then you can go away now. And whenever we have this conversation, they say, well, maybe if we had some slightly different officials, or maybe if I argued with them for a bit longer. I mean, even very powerful, persuasive politicians who've been, prime ministers and finance ministers, they're like asking for sympathy. They say, "Oh, it's just shocking. I try to get through, and I just can't. It just can't make it happen." And I wonder, it's all part of this story of capture. This idea that late stage capitalism, you could argue, and the sort of 30, 40 years on from the end of the Cold War, the neoliberal, what was Francis Fukuyama's line, history.
The end of history.
The end of history. We won.
Right.
It's all over.
It's over.
It's great. Whether 40 years on is dawning on us that actually during that time, that 40 years, our wonderful system either was never working to start with, or has been quietly captured by ideas, by institutions, by not necessarily individuals, but certainly interests. And it hasn't really dawned on us yet. I'm wondering if that whole idea of capture is something that, again, has also undermined trust.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think we weren't considering, when we developed this neoliberal framework and we thought it was going to be the Holy Grail, no one really counted for the impact of migration, the reaction to migration, right? So we have this pushback and this resistance because we thought this was going to be great. And then we didn't account for technology and Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook launching in 2004 and the impact that had on politics and on people's perception and on the media. And so we didn't account for these things, and no one is thinking about the shifts necessary institutionally at a system level with this economic and political framework on how to do that. And if you compound that by low civic education, like we have in New Zealand, it's a little bit of a insurmountable social, political, and economic issue, it seems like.
Yeah, the trajectory seems bleak, I have to say.
Really bleak. I agree.
But, hey, I get up every morning and I try and look for some positive things. And so, what sort of policies, processes could turn this around? What sort of things could we do to earn that trust back, or to capture the arms of government back from whoever's got it, to impose or have better transparency or safeguards so that the capture can't happen? What sort of things could we do?
Well, I'm going to sound really boring, maybe. I don't know if this is the sexiest suggestions, but I really believe that civic education in schools and for candidates. So schools aside, let's assume that we can implement that and we can pay for it. But even if we can't, just for candidates running for government and for local council, in my experience in 2013 of running in Wellington Central, as someone that has been studying political science in New Zealand quite formally, I could see the discrepancies in the understandings of how things worked. And these candidates were promising things that were fundamentally impossible to do. And if we could only educate the candidates, even like if the Electoral Commission could do like an induction course of basic understanding of the relationship between Parliament and the public service, the Treasury and publicly elected officials, I think that could make a huge difference. Because just to close and not to drag on too much, I think the other reason trust is declining is because during the campaign period, which we don't really focus on as a key moment in trust in institutions, candidates are promising things that they can't deliver. Also because they're campaigning in first past the post mode, like in winners and lose, what are you going to do single-handedly to reduce poverty? When in reality, we govern in an MMP system. And that confuses people because we're not campaigning to demonstrate how we can collaborate and how we can build coalitions. We're campaigning as how I, by myself, can do it with my party. And then we get into government, we sign these coalition agreements, we come out with a policy about smoking that no one heard about, and everyone's really confused. And so I think it does come down to civic education, and that period of campaigning, I think, is grossly overlooked. And candidates need to do a little bit better in terms of what they're promising and why.
Yes. We'll talk about this again, Natalia. I think you've opened up a really interesting way to go. You know, how do we try to deal with this? I love this idea of the candidate school before they stand.
Thanks.
Because what I've actually noticed, particularly in local government, is that the candidates, you're right, stand, say outrageous things one way or the other. They get elected, and then they often have this induction course where they are then schooled by the local officials.
It's too late.
Yeah.
It's too little. It's too little, too late. And I think all candidates must understand what they're promising when they go out on the campaign trail. And I think it's grossly irresponsible that as a nation, we haven't quite identified that, because the promises they make are awful. And people are like, "Rah, yeah, this is amazing." And I'm like, they're never going to achieve that. The trust is going to decline. The expectation is not going to be met. So anyway, that's my hot thing, the hill that I want to die on.
Yeah. Natalia, thank you very much for that. I'd love to come back and talk more about these ideas, but also, ways to solve the issue, and to try to, talk about it honestly and upfront, because that's something we don't always see in the world of politics, where it seems mostly about I win, you lose, and
Helpful.
And I'm going to do this, and hopefully you won't remember in 3 days' time when it hasn't happened.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, thank you, Bernard. And this has prompted some inspiration for my next article. So I'll keep writing about this because this was an incredible conversation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Natalia. And I'd highly recommend Natalia's Substack, Less Certain. There is a link in the show notes, as they say. And look forward to talking to you again. Ka kite anō. This has been a Mini-Hoon on the Kaka. I'm Bernard Hickey. Thank you.